Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Reimer. I'm Director of Research Communications in our Department of Marketing and Communication, and thank you for coming out on this miserable day. It is really humbling to introduce this panel. They are all distinguished journalists, and they have a long list of accomplishments that I won't even have time to go into, and then we've got a room full of scientists. And first I want to thank Gloria Waters, the Vice President and Associate Provost for Research. This wouldn't be happening if it weren't for Gloria. She is, she's all about building bridges among scientists at BU and also between scientists and the public. And she does everything to help our researchers tell their stories. That's why we have this beautiful research news website that Barbara Moran runs as managing editor. I was a New York Times reporter for 26 years, and I didn't cover science, and so I'm having the privilege of learning about science here at BU, and I have to say it's the best beat I've ever had. So now I'm going to introduce this panel. First, on the far right, David Corcoran, and we both started at the New York Times around the same time, 26 years ago. He had a variety of jobs at the Times. He was the editor of the education section. He was a deputy op-ed editor. And then he went and ran the Science Times section, which you all know, and he pioneered the Science Times podcast. Now he's an associate director of the Knight Science Journalism Fellowship Program, which brings mid-career science journalists to MIT for the academic year. He's also senior editor of Undark, an award-winning independent online science magazine published by the Knight program. And he is the founder and host of the Undark podcast, which just published its 20th monthly episode. And if I have this right, it's the one on the national parks, which is terrific. David is also a published poet, and I believe he has to leave a little early to get to a poetry reading or a meeting of his poetry group. Next is Helen Branswell, who is a senior writer at STAT, the online news publication focused on health, medicine, and scientific discovery. She covers infectious diseases and global health for STAT. Helen came to STAT from the Canadian Press, where she was the National News Agency's medical reporter from 2000 to 2015. She was a 2004 Center for Disease Control Knight Fellow, spending 3 months embedded at the CDC. She was also a 2011 Neiman Global Health Fellow at Harvard, where her work focused on polio eradication. I was at a big needle symposium last year with a lot of people in the audience, and I heard somebody point to Helen, who was ahead of me, and say, "That's Helen Branswell." Next, we have Bruce Gellerman, an award-winning journalist and senior correspondent frequently covering science, business, technology, and the environment. Bruce is a member of WBUR's Bostonomics team, focusing on stories about energy, the environment, and the future of just about everything. And I hope he's going to tell you about an exciting new vertical that he's starting. Evan Hadingham is the senior science editor of NOVA, the PBS science series produced at WGBH in Boston. And he has editorial responsibility for the science content of all NOVA programs. He's the author of popular books and feature articles on prehistory and archaeology. And now we come to Barbara Moran, who's a veteran science journalist in her own right. Her work has appeared in many publications, including the New York Times, New Scientist, Technology Review, and the Boston Globe magazine. She has also produced documentary television for PBS and the Discovery Channel. She has something in common with David Corcoran because she was a Knight Fellow at MIT from 2001 to 2002. She just received her second Science and Society Award from the National Association of Science Writers, and that's their highest honor. So take it away, Barb.
Hi, everybody. Is this on? You're supposed to say that when you talk to a mic the first time. So what we're going to do is have each of the panelists introduce themselves, give a brief introduction to their work and how they see the interplay of science with science journalism. We'll each talk for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions. Okay? Evan, you can kick it off.
Well, we're starting here with perhaps one of the more exotic forms of science communication, the endangered 1-hour long-form science documentary. I mean, we're now in our 44th season on NOVA. I'm told that only General Hospital has a longer run on on network television. And sometimes I feel like I've been there that long myself. But we have, this very peculiar demands of a 1 hour, high-end, very expensive documentary program that requires big questions, big ideas, very difficult questions of structure and how you use the talent. It gets increasingly complex, it seems to me, not easier as we go on in time. But the thing I want to emphasize is that now we're a totally different operation to what we were even 3 or 4 years ago, I think, because under the NOVA roof at GBH is not just our little it is a small documentary team, but and rapidly graying like myself, but a much younger group of people that are really engaged in putting NOVA out there on all kinds of other platforms. And now the impact of a 1 hour program goes far beyond broadcast because we're developing all these other ways of communicating. For example, we're now regularly producing short form videos, turning them around in a week or so for YouTube and other outlets that relate to a particular show, but are ways of not only grabbing an audience, but putting out extra little bits of science content. As well as that, we've been having great success with Facebook Live events, most notably the show that we did, 2-hour show that we did live on the solar eclipse with Miles O'Brien, where Miles managed to talk his way right through the entire event and keep going with this flow of brilliant commentary that he does. And that became the most popular event PBS has done so far on Facebook Live. It got over 1 million views. So that really built up a following. And when you think about, a NOVA show reaches average 4 or 5 million people, but when you start looking at these related events, they're really building up significant numbers. I think that tells you about the changing nature of science communication. Then we have a lot of other initiatives that I won't go into, but for example, our science cafes, where we're trying to go out in the neighborhoods. We help organize that in over 300 cities. So there are lots of ways we're trying to get out there and connect with scientists and with the research community, as well as our viewers. And I wanted to just address the idea or the question of how do I become aware of a scientist that would work really well for any one of these platforms. And TV's is visual, dramatic, story-driven medium. So it's kind of obvious that we need good talkers who are able to they can't be long-winded. They have to come up with their ideas in a concise form. But I think quite a lot of scientists just sit there hoping to be discovered. They hope that if they do good enough work and just put their stuff out there, that journalists and TV people will come to them. And sometimes that happens. But when I go looking for somebody who's going to work well, I will definitely gravitate to somebody who is already telling a story, not just, that their web presence has got to be more, usually has got to be more than just such and such works in this department. Here's a list of their publications. Thank you very much. Here's my number and email. If there is if you show an ability and an interest in communicating with the public right on your homepage, including video and all the rest of it, then I'm far more likely to think, oh, well, I'm not wasting my time with this person. And so similarly, and I can talk about this a little bit more, there are all these opportunities now for scientists to go out on social media, on these alternative platforms, to go make your own videos, tell your story. And that way, you can get some real synergy going, hopefully. I just want to give one example that's really stuck in my mind. That NOVA's producing a show on the international drilling operation that for the first time went into the, in April this year, drilled into the Chicxulub impact crater in Mexico. This is the crater that did in the dinosaurs. And this is the first time that anybody's gone in and really tried to drill right through and do this huge cross-section to figure out the precise geology of the impact, which allows you to constrain the energy of the blast and figure out just how nasty it was, just, you know, what kind of damage was done. It's a great project, pretty technical, and I did all these phone calls with the chief scientists and read the papers, and I felt like I had a good handle on it. And then somebody turned me on to Reddit, and their AMA series, their Ask Me Another series, and it turns out that the scientific team did a Reddit AMA, and this is, if you don't know it, this is essentially like an interactive conversation where for 24 hours a team of scientists will kind of sit there, I don't know where they do it, and just answer all questions, all sent in randomly from people on the web, and you build up this long trail of questions and answers. And so they did it once, just as they were going into the drilling project, and once afterwards, as they were evaluating, doing the initial results from the core. And it was the most incredible resource, because there were all these things that it hadn't occurred to me to ask. And then the scientists, they weren't talking formally to their peers, right? They were talking to ordinary people, so they were using ordinary language. They were having to talk and communicate in the way normal people do, regular people do. And so I printed out, you know, I'm still something of a print guy. So, you know, I printed out all 25 pages of these two blogs, but this became my go-to place. So this tells you that this can work both ways, and that, you know, for scientists to make use of these new tools and communication techniques can really benefit journalists and benefit everybody, of course. So I'm going to stop there.
Great. Thank you, Evan. That was great. Okay.
So it's interesting that both Barbara and Evan use the word stories or story to talk about what they do. And that's all I do. I'm just a storyteller. You can call me a reporter or a journalist. I think it's a little highfalutin. But, you know, and that I define as explaining things I don't understand. Because as a reporter, you've got to be very quick study, whether you're talking about biology or astronomy, geology, you know, I mean, whatever the subject is, how would you know? So the attribute that I find, the attributes I find most interesting or most important is the skill set of both curiosity and the ability to be basically a processor of information. You know, I think if you ask anybody here, they might not even remember what stories they worked on that week. You walk down the hallways and somebody will say to you, and this is a high compliment, right? They'll say, "Oh, I really like that story you did." They won't remember what it was about, but they really remember they like it. So you become just this information processor. The art of reporting is also kind of, especially radio, which is such an efficient way of reporting, and I like doing documentaries, but documentaries now are like 4 minutes long on the radio. You'll hear public radio even, you know, the sound bites last 3 seconds, 2 seconds. My boss pointed out that the other day that there was a two-way, we call it an interview, right? An interview is a two-way. If you have 3 people, it's called a three-way, blah, blah, blah. He said to me, "I heard an interview that was 11 and a half seconds. That was on public radio, I swear." And I said, "Yeah, I heard it." We just reacted to it because I hate to say this, but yes, it's true. I'm old school. I like spending some time on a story. I need it to evolve. I need the story to tell me a story, right? Give me a place, give me a scene, give me action, give me characters. So that's how I approach my work, but my work has dramatically changed, and it's changing really dramatically now. So before, I just used to be a radio reporter, and then I had to do print, and you know, so because you had to post things online, you had to do photos. So I've got to do the photos. Sometimes I have a photographer, and I can call upon them. But the way we've organized WBUR is in these, as Barbara alluded, there's these verticals. What we have there is verticals. Bostonomics is a thing where the intersection of brains and business and the innovation economy. Okay, so that's a subject, and we organize a team around it, and we can get, as a vertical, as a subject, we can access different resources in the organization. WBUR is now, we do, in fact, most people now read my stuff as opposed to hear it. It's extraordinary, and it really pisses me off, to be honest with you, right? Because I spend a lot of time in my audio. The sound tells the story for me. I build the story from sound bites, sound. I want to take my listener there. I want to tap into their imagination. I want them to hear the story that I hear in my head, right? It's like when you have a kid that's sitting in bed, right? They say, "Once upon a time, there was a big bed." Well, I can do that too, right? And then now you're off to the races. And I've got inside your head, and you've got this incredible panorama. So given that the fact that you've got this ADHD audience now, I'm sorry, and I apologize, but somehow my editors think that you don't have an attention span, which is kind of weird since we have podcasts, which can go long form, and they don't have, and they totally keep your attention, right? And yet somehow we've got to shrink wrap these things into, listen to the leads, the introduction to the stories. They're a sentence and a half. Okay, so I'll bend, I do bend. And I bend them back. But my editors want to hear, how long is it going to be? How long do you need to tell me the story that you don't understand? Explain the story you don't understand, right? And I have to give that to them in less than 3 sentences. If I cannot tell them in 3 sentences what the story is about, I don't have a story as far as they're concerned, okay? So when you're communicating with me, and your communication with me is over a period of time. There's a man back in the audience there, Jeff Berger, and I know him for forever. I mean, like, really forever. And so it's a relationship business. And I'll leave it there because I can keep on going back. So, Helen.
Go ahead, Helen. Thank you.
Just to make you feel better, I actually prefer to get my news from radio, but I write for print, or today's equivalent of print, I write online.
Helen, can you just move a little closer to the mic? Thanks.
Sure. We were asked to sort of talk to you about how we do our work so that you could have some takeaways in terms of how you might interact with us and, what to do, what not to do. So I'm going to be a little bit more prescriptive, I think, maybe, than the first 2 people on the panel. I don't publish a story daily, but I am working in daily news, and typically in a week, depending on how busy the week is, I will write 2, 3, 4 more stories. Hopefully not more, hopefully not 4, but I'm constantly working on things, and there's pressure to produce. I go through a lot of journals. We get advanced mailings from the journals telling us what they're going to be publishing, get the information under embargo, and so I have to keep my eye on what's coming out to see if there's something that's in my area that I think merits coverage. I get pitches, and if you don't understand what the term in this context, it means from press people at universities, from professional communications teams, from agencies like the WHO and the CDC, and also sometimes from individual scientists who I know, saying, this is coming out. We've just published this. Are you interested in this topic? And I get so many of them. I can't answer most of them. I don't answer the ones that I'm not interested in. It's a frustrating thing because it takes up such a big portion of my day plowing through all that stuff, although I do plow through all that stuff, and I would suspect most journalists do. If you are writing pitches, I would suggest you really try to focus your pitch to somebody who might actually write about what you're trying to get them to write about. I often get emails from PR firms talking to me about the need. I got one today about people who need blood transfusions, need them quickly. And it's like, well, I don't write about that, so thanks very much. That's not a good use of your time, and it's not a good use of the time of the person who has to go through the pitch. Somebody mentioned, I think you both mentioned relationships. If you can get to know reporters and sort of know who writes about the things that you are studying and working on, that will help you a lot. You can kind of keep in touch, sort of say, I'm working on X or Y. It may not lead to anything in the short term, but over the long term, the reporter will think of you as somebody to go to, sometimes to see how your work is doing, sometimes because we always have to get when we're doing a story about something, we need to get people who are knowledgeable about that field, but who are not involved in that particular study, for instance, to bounce it off them and say, hey, they say this is the best thing since forever. Is that true? How does this square with the rest of the field? And it's really valuable to have somebody you can trust to say, yes, it's useful, but they haven't acknowledged X or Y, and that could be, a really big omission. Having people you can trust to go to for that kind of stuff is really important. Give us notice. I routinely have people who email me at 3 o'clock in the afternoon with something that's coming out the next morning at 9. And I'm working on something already that day, so I can't start it then. And I'm not working all night. Nobody's going to pay me to work all night. And, if the issue was so important, of course I would work all night, but most of these things aren't. So, give us notice. When you're going to talk to a journalist, especially if you haven't done it a lot or if you've never spoken to the journalist before, it's really important to get some ground rules down at the beginning of the conversation. If you think you're going to want to talk to them off the record or on background, ask them, what that means for them. Because frankly, I think if you were to ask all of us, we might not all come up with the same definition of what those terms mean. If you want to say something that you don't want them to repeat, but you want them to know so that they can go out and find that information some other way without attributing it to you, I would say that would be
off the record, on background.
Anyway, the point is, if you're going to do that kind of thing, establish in advance how much protection you're getting from the person and know what they think that means. If you don't mind seeing in the story, Dean Heller was terrible at running the department's finances, said a person who asked not to be named. If you're okay with that, then, establish that that's the way it's going to be. But, if you don't want to see that quote like that, then you maybe need to think about having a different prescription in place before you talk to the person. Likewise, if you're expecting to see the story that is produced before it's published, you should talk to the reporter you're talking with. I would not show you my story before it's published. Most journalists that I know won't do that, but some will, I guess, I hear. Some will cut agreements where they'll show you what the portion of the story that relates to you. Again, I won't do that, but don't find yourself at the end of an interview of 30 minutes or something then saying, oh, and by the way, you're going to show it to me before you publish it, right? If you want that kind of arrangement, you need to say that right off the top and see what happens after that. What else would I say? Evan was talking about how it's important not to be long-winded and to talk in the way that you talk to people, not peers, and that for me is hugely important. And that actually is one of the things that sometimes poses problems when scientists who want to vet material in advance come back to me and say, oh, I wish you had said that I said X. And it's just like, well, but you said it this way. And they said, yeah, but it doesn't sound professional. And it's like, you sound like a person, that's what I'm trying to include in my story. And I tape my story, so I know exactly what the person said. You're telling stories to the public. You're not presenting something at a conference, and you need to sound like the way people talk when you do that. I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. So, as Sarah mentioned, I've done a great many things in my very long career as a journalist. But one thing that I thought might be practically used to this group was my experience as an editorial page editor and deputy op-ed editor at the New York Times. So I want to talk about the op-ed form. Does anybody know what op-ed is short for? Say it again.
Somebody said it.
Yeah.
Close. It stands for opposite the editorial page.
Yeah.
This is the very first op-ed page in the New York Times from September 29th, 1971. And as you see, the editorials are over there on the left-hand column of the left-hand page, the letters to the editor. And then on the right is what they, a term that I believe was coined by the New York Times, the op-ed page. This is a set of short essays. Some of them are by columnists for the Times, but others are by civilians, non-journalists who have opinions and want to express them in a public forum. How many scientists do we have in the room? Lots. I'm going to tell you a secret. By virtue of being a scientist, you are an expert and you have credibility to state your opinion, not only on whatever field you may be working on, but on science as a whole, on scientific issues, the scientific process. So if this is a form that interests you at all, I want to talk to you a little bit about how they're done. The landscape of the news industry has changed radically since 1971. I don't need to tell you that. But the fact is the op-ed page hasn't changed very much at all. That's an op-ed page in the New York Times from this year. And except for the absence of the ad, the big quarter-page ad, which paid some bills back in those days, they don't get so many ads anymore. But other than that, it's pretty much the same thing. 2 columns by regular New York Times columnists and 2 essays by outside experts who want to express an opinion. I flagged that one on the left just because it's a pretty representative example of what an op-ed looks like. It expresses an opinion. You can tell what the opinion is just by looking at the headline. And you can see that it occupies just 1 column of type. So that's about 800 words, and that's a very typical length for an op-ed piece. Is Susan Crawford in the room by any chance? So I've developed a thing, a list that I call, there was a book in the 70s or 80s called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. So this is 7 questions for highly effective op-ed writers. This is what you want to ask yourself before writing and pitching and trying to place an op-ed piece. First of all, why is it important? Why would anyone care? Obvious question. Why is it important now? There are many issues that are important. We know that the survival of the Republic is important, but what is it about the survival of the Republic that needs to be told right now? So this is a question you have to ask yourself and be prepared to answer as you write your article. And this, I'm going to take a small detour into a little journalistic jargon, the nut graph. Anybody know what that means? No reason you would. The nut graph, it's sometimes called the billboard paragraph or the so what paragraph, graph being short for paragraph. The nut is the kernel of the piece. Why are you telling this to me now? It's the paragraph or sometimes 2 paragraphs, several sentences that answer that question for the reader. It's kind of entertaining to go on, to just do an online search for the term nut graph, and you'll get some interesting this is the nut graph of Susan Crawford's article, and I'm not gonna dwell on it. But notice that it occurs in the third paragraph within the first 150 words of an 800-word story. That's typical, and that is what you should aim to do if you're writing for a mass audience. You don't want to delay the impact. You know, scientific papers sometimes save the big reveal for, you know, way near the end, at the, 13,000 word mark. You don't want to do that when you're writing for a general audience. You want to let them know why you're telling them what you're telling them, and why it's important now. Okay, who is your audience? In the case of the New York Times, you kind of know. It's several million now, fairly educated and curious, probably politically liberal readers for the most part. Important to know that. What's your word limit? As I said, this typical op-ed article about Trump's telecom giveaway, 800 words. Need to establish that up front. Sometimes op-ed pieces can run a little longer, up to 12 or 1,300 words, but you need to know that in advance, and you need to write the article as with a strong awareness of how much room you've got, how many words you've got to make your point. What information do you need to make your point? Kind of an obvious question, but in my experience as an op-ed editor, I found that often the writer wasn't quite aware of the answer to the question. What are the best arguments against your point? You always have to think about how your argument might be rebutted and what a person might reasonably say or wonder about the argument that you're making. So have you made making a convincing case requires that you be prepared to rebut the arguments on the other side. And finally, did you get everything right? It's really important to check yourself. It's really embarrassing to make errors. I'm going to stop, but I want to say that even though the news business has changed utterly, even in the last 10 years, in unpredictable ways, the op-ed as an art form, a journalistic form, is alive and well. There's still more than 1,000 newspapers in the United States. Most of them have op-ed pages. Most of them are eager for original content. They often don't get a lot of original content, but they're eager to have it. So you guys are very well positioned, if you want to write for them. Besides the newspapers, there's now a proliferation of online publications, including my own, Undark, which publish opinion essays. There's a wonderful new site I believe, based in the Boston area called The Conversation. Anybody? I see heads nodding. Those folks specifically reach out to academic writers to write opinion essays about all manner of things that are of interest to general readers. So there are lots of opportunities, think of us first. Undark.
That was great. Thank you. We're going to open the floor for questions now. We have two people going around with mics. If you have a question, can you raise your hand and they'll come over to you and speak into the mic? Anyone? Okay, up here up front. And can you please tell us your name and your field? Thanks.
My name is Brooke, and I work in biology. I have a question for Helen. So one thing that we deal with in my field, we study animal responses to climate change. Mm-hmm. There's some concern over the degree to which the journalists can control the message, because there's a great risk of our work being misconstrued by the public, where we have situations where, scientific reservation translates into uncertainty. Mm-hmm. I guess a two-part question. how do you recommend that we, make it clear to journalists, besides that question or that point you made about, asking, does that mean to you the same thing that it means to me? But how do we also establish trust that, if something doesn't come across clearly to the journalist, that the journalist will not kind of take the reins and be irresponsible with the information that's given? Like, how do we navigate that and make sure that there's like equal footing and understanding?
Okay, so I'm going to start off by asking you to, can you leave the mic? Start by asking you to sort of rephrase that question a little bit, because I have to confess, when you started, I was thinking, oh, this is kind of PETA concern type of things. You're concerned about I sort of thought I saw the frame through which you were asking the question, but I don't think I saw it correctly. You're not concerned we would misconstrue the research because you work with animals. That's not what.
No.
Okay.
No. Sorry that I was unclear.
No, it's okay.
I think, like, my biggest concern is that if I were to go to a journalist with our findings and, speak in the typical reserved manner of a scientist, because you don't want to overstate what you found and you want to make sure that future work can confirm what you found, how do we effectively communicate with the journalist to be sure that the message doesn't get lost in translation? Like in the traditional example is, I think, a lot of information around what consensus means in science, and making sure that when it does get put into a story by a journalist, that it's clear that what the scientist, what their perspective is on the topic is accurately represented.
Right. Well, I mean, one thing, you're going to want to work with your press office right off the top, right, to sort of figure out what you want to say and how far you want to allow this to go. And it may depend. I mean, you may be talking about, if you have data that you're going to publish, you may not be speaking to people like us until after you publish anyway, because it could get in the way of your chances of publication. I think when you're talking to a journalist, don't overstate what you know. Make clear the limits of how far you can read the data. I always tell people who are concerned, like who I've never spoken to before, who ask me, for instance, if they can see the piece before I publish. When I tell them that they can't, I say, but can you tell from the conversation that we're having that I understand what you're saying? Because typically, when you're being interviewed, if the journalist is really off base, you'll know by the kinds of questions they're asking, and then you start to steer them back. Sometimes you could think that you had a conversation or an interview that went really well, and see afterwards that that wasn't the case. But I would think in most cases you would see it.
Well, I think the word is conversation, right? So it's not an interview, it's a give and take. Right? So you can ask questions and you can test and you can say, do you understand? And what about this? And it's a two-way street. What we have to do is take what you do and you do every day of the week. We have to reduce it. It's the art of subtraction. We're trying to find the essence of the information. And I know that we do this, right? We're always asking you, is this right? You can hear it in our questions, right? And we take a lot of time doing that. It takes a lot of time. So, and then the notion of translation, yes, you have a language that's yours, and we have to understand it, navigate it, but again, it comes back to that conversation being a two-way street. You should be empowered and feel absolutely free to ask the question, because that's how conversations work.
I also didn't say this, but I meant to in my opening remarks. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you have done an interview and you see the resulting article and you see that something is wrong, get in touch as quickly as possible. I mean, even the best journalists make mistakes. No journalist I've ever encountered wants to make a mistake. We're all mortified when we do, but we all do. And the sooner you correct, especially with the online world, the better it is. Like literally, that morning, as soon as you see it, get in touch, because we will correct. And, the sooner we get the mistake off the web, the better it is for everybody, because mistakes proliferate. Journalists often do their research by reading other articles, and so if something sits out there, it can, amplify the mistake. Does that answer your question? Okay, thanks.
Can I just ask you guys, a lot of scientists, I hear this from a lot of scientists who are concerned about factual errors and want to see their quotes or read the piece, and in general, it's not customary. Can you tell me why you don't do it?
It's prior approval. It's, it's in a nutshell. I don't want to give you any hold over what we're going to be saying and how I say it. Simply that. I've got an editor who does that, and they hold your feet to the fire if they're a good editor, right? But we get it wrong. And the last thing I say so it's a relationship. When I know that a piece is going to air, for example, I'll write to the people that are in the piece. And I'll say, if you hear anything incorrect or inaccurate, let me know. I tell them that every time. I did a story just before walking in here. It's exactly what I did.
In terms of my answer to Barbara's question, nowhere I've ever worked has allowed us to show our stories to people who are in the stories in advance of publication. It's simply, basic policy. And I don't disagree with the policy. I'm writing news, and you can tell me a whole bunch of stuff, and your idea of what the most important thing is might be something, but I might actually find something else more interesting, and that may be the story I pursue. And it's not wrong. You might be frustrated that I didn't focus on what you wanted me to focus on, but the story that I pursue is, a perfectly valid story. If I show it to you in advance, we may end up with a back and forth about, your disappointment, but it's not going to change the outcome. And in terms of the quotes issue, I have, on rare occasions, I will agree to send somebody quotes if they really insist, and if they want to be able to see what I'm going to say that they said in quotation marks. I don't like to do it because they always come back and they've moved things around and they've edited what they've said and they've made themselves sound more professorial. And then I have to go back to them and say, that's not this process. Right. I'm not giving you a chance to say what you wished you had said. I'm just giving you the courtesy of showing you what you did say and what I'm going to use in your piece.
Nowadays, reporters typically record their conversations. I guess Bruce records every conversation.
No, I don't. Sometimes they're off the record in the background.
Oh, well, right, okay. Many publications, including ours, have a fact-checking desk, which will not necessarily read back quote verbatim to the source, but will say will call or email the source and say, "Did you say this?" The seventh habit of highly effective op-ed writers is getting everything right. Mm-hmm. And that means that if you're the least bit unsure of anything, you really owe it both to your source and to your readers to go back and check.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for Nova, the kind of exception to this that we do a lot is where it's something highly technical but a process, or particularly animations we show. And there's really kind of no alternative but to go back to the original side, as to say, are we, is this in the ballpark? But anything more than that risks, unleashing a horror show. Mostly because if you send pieces of the script out, a TV story in print can often seem really dumb to somebody who's not used to the just the difference in storytelling and TV, even the highest level, even a Nova about quantum entanglement is kind of this emotional journey. We are actually doing the story on a whole hour on quantum entanglement. So this is a hard-earned piece that I'm thinking about. But anyway, so the upshot of this is that we put half of what I do is fact checking, even though we have a full-time fact checker on staff. Half of what I do is fact checking on the shows that I particularly care about, because I won't let anybody near certain shows that I feel are just too much in my wheelhouse or matter too much. And furthermore, all our contracts set with outside producers say you have to give us an annotated script with 2 footnoted sources for every statement, and we put a huge amount of effort into it because it's very easy to make mistakes. Bottom line,
We should say that it's rare, but increasingly frequent, where somebody we're interviewing or an organization will actually record their end of the conversation. You should know that Massachusetts is a 2-party state. Both sides have to know that they're being recorded.
Can I just make a point about the fact checking?
Helen, could you just pull the mic a little bit closer to you again? Thanks.
It's really important if you're going to be dealing with the media, if you're going to be on the interviewee side as opposed to the side where you're doing the writing, you should know the kind of place and sort of the food chain of media. So David was talking about Undark, which is a magazine, and magazines generally have fact checkers. And of course, Evan is talking about sort of the Cadillac of long form video. I've never worked for either of those kinds of organizations. I mean, I'd done a few magazine pieces and I had fact checkers, but at newspapers and at sort of daily news sites, it's not common, I don't think, to have fact checkers. I mean, I will certainly go back to people if I'm having trouble in writing, or if I think that in the way I'm sort of distilling something, I may be getting it wrong. I will certainly go back to the person and say, if I describe it as in this way, is this correct? And everybody that I've ever dealt with is very happy to sort of dive in at that point.
Right, thanks.
So yeah, distillation is the notion, right? The art of subtraction. It's not so much actually what you put into a story is what you're going to take out, because vastly more information is being taken out. So you kind of lose a lot there. The motto is, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. So my editors are always saying, does your mother love you? So you're very skeptical, and you have to prove it. Show me, show me, show me, show me.
There's a couple questions in the back there.
Thank you. I'm Monica Wang. I'm a public health scientist. One of the common recommendations for scientists in communicating with the public is to avoid jargon and to talk about your research in lay terms. And the work that I do is around promoting diet and physical activity, obesity, and avoiding chronic disease. So my question is, what are your recommendations for how to frame science or do an op-ed piece on a topic that people have a lot to say about, even if they don't know too much about it for the evidence?
Oh, everybody has something to say about obesity. Who wants to take that one?
Explain it to your friend. I do this all the time, right? I have something complicated. I turn around to somebody I trust and I try to explain it to them. If I can't, again, I don't have a story. I don't understand it. That's what I do. I do that all the time.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. You need to have a dialogue between the source, the expert, and the communicator, the writer, the reporter, and they need to understand each other. If there's a gap because of jargon or the difficulty of the concept, I think that's a bigger problem. Some of these things, like gene editing or gravitational waves, these are hugely complicated things that people come to understand only after many years of study. So then how do you communicate that to a general audience? Well, that's the challenge. It's also the delight. It's what makes us want to get up in the morning.
What have you guys, I'm sure you've all been in an experience where you're interviewing someone and they're sliding into jargon land. Do you have a technique that you pull them back? Do you try to ask them to explain something in a metaphor, or pretend I'm your
I just say,
child?
I'm sorry, I don't understand. I mean, if I can't understand it, I can't explain it. So, yeah.
Typically, a producer will say, "That's great. Now, could you say that again and use slightly fewer words, or can you please not use that word electrophoresis?"
Yeah, I can just turn away with my microphone and my eyes glaze over and they get the message.
Ouch. Okay, great. There was some that in the, there in the back.
Hi, I'm Wesley Wildman. I run a research centre here. What do you guys want to see in a press kit, and what sorts of things do you want to see in press releases? And
What was the last word?
Press kit and press releases. And in regard to press releases, how do we get them to the right people as against just posting them where we normally post them?
Good question.
Yeah, not easy. I'm not completely sure I know what a press kit is. Press release I'm familiar with, but the challenge in producing a press release, I think, is the identical challenge that a writer faces in writing a news story or news article or an op-ed article for a general audience, and that is, it must be understandable to a layperson, somebody who does not have any background or necessarily have any background in the subject. So, and this is a hard thing to do, especially if you are highly educated in these concepts and are accustomed to talking with colleagues in shorthand. Suddenly you have to take a big step back and communicate it in language that an 8th grader could understand. It's not an easy thing to do.
So in terms of a press kit, when I'm writing about something that's complicated, it's really helpful. Some universities do this very, very well. You'll get a pitch, and the pitch will include a link to a Dropbox where you'll have images and short videos of the researcher explaining the significance of the discovery and any other sort of supplementary audio-visual materials that you guys can put together. It makes life a lot easier, both for the people who, for our photo editor who's trying to figure out how to illustrate a particular piece. I'm working on the web. If you can't have pictures, it really doesn't fly. So being able to put good visuals in is really important. And I guess I'll leave it there.
So I think case study for a great job was the LIGO announcement at MIT, right? Very complicated science. We knew it was kind of coming. Anybody would follow this stuff, but it's really complicated stuff. Gravitational waves, So they were very out front. They embargoed the releases. They made themselves available so we could understand this. We could ask questions. They didn't overload us with information. They had some really very well-written releases, meaning stuff that laid it out there for us. And then they also understood that we're salesmen. That is, we have to sell up a food chain, right? I've got to convince an editor and maybe a managing editor or assignment editor, maybe the news director, that this deserves space in that show or that time, and it deserves this much space, not this much space or that much space, but this much. So I had a gauge of where I needed to be and when I needed to have it, right? And then they had the conversation.
The second part of your question was, how do you find the person who should see this stuff in order to get it out there? This is not easy, and there are probably as many different ways to do it as there are news organizations. Some organizations are quite transparent, others are not. It requires hunting around. It is something, though, that you learn with experience. Once you have penetrated the science desk at the New York Times, you generally have an idea of who's there and whose email address you need.
Yeah, it comes back to that relationship, right?
Yeah, I think it's really important to to know who writes about the kinds of things that you're trying to get written about. Sending it out to 1 million people is probably not that effective. And sometimes, frankly, getting it in 2 or 3 places, like if the Washington Post gives it a really nice spread, if the Times gives it a really nice spread, you'll get follow-on coverage because other journalists will see it. So sometimes all you need is somebody who understands it and will write a good piece on it, and you could be off to the races.
And if you get a great piece, right, it's a great story, and you want to give it to one organization, tell them that you're giving them an exclusive.
Oh, I thought you were going to say, tell them, give it to you.
You are, yeah.
The second part, right? I mean, and then mean it. Nobody likes getting beat when they're ahead of a story. Oh man, that's the end of that relationship.
Can you just be specific? What do you mean by an exclusive? That they do not talk to anyone else about a story?
Oh, they can talk to other people. I want it first. This is guerrilla warfare, hand-to-hand combat. It's a contact sport, right? I want to, that's what makes it news. I got it. You want it. Come on. That's the way I look at it. I'm not ruthless, but I like having it, and then everybody follows me. That's okay with me.
It's a complicated thing, and you sort of have to get a feel for it, because sometimes, as I said, getting somebody to write about something will lead to follow-on coverage. But sometimes other people will go, well, it's already been covered, and I'm not going to spend my time on it. I'll go on and do other things, and I can't predict for you in advance how a particular story is going to work, but it could go either way.
Interesting. Okay, there's another question in the back too.
Hi, I'm Matthias. I'm just starting to get into neuroscience, but my background's more in music and language. And I'm wondering, sometimes you see these, especially online stories, that actually link the original paper, if that's out, or something that's already been put on the web, like a longer story. Do you have any idea on how much that actually gets used, and how do you feel about that? Like a researcher might feel, oh, that's great because my original message is there. But do you think that might hurt the message sometimes that we're trying to get out to the reader as well?
For me, it's totally, it's a huge thing. I rely so much on academia.edu and ResearchGate to get out maybe I'm more of a geek than my fellows, but I absolutely read the papers fully to understand the specific subject. And I'm an old-fashioned print guy. I have to print out these damn papers, and they have little piles on my desk. But of course I talk to the scientists, but particularly things like academia.edu are really essential to me for understanding the landscape of how this idea is going down. If I can find opposing views, that's the way I work anyway, or one way I work.
I'm not sure I understood your question.
Right.
Are you saying that you asking if including a link in the story? I don't know that I'm not sure I could see how it could be bad. We do it. We think that the readers expect it, and but I can't give you any metrics on how often it's clicked on in one of our stories. But
I'm sorry.
go ahead.
What's bad is linking to an article that is behind a paywall.
Yeah, people hate that.
That's extremely frustrating.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it makes
That is a problem with studies because so many journals.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
Oh,
Way in the back had his hand up for a while, and then we'll go to you next.
Yeah, I'm actually a ringer here. My name is Jerry Berger. I ran a media relations office at a hospital for a number of years. I'm now teaching journalism here at BU, teaching political journalism. So there's a couple of things that I picked up here because of the perspective I'm having these days. I think it's important to understand when you're talking about science journalism that in all likelihood you are going to be speaking to someone who is pretty well versed in science. You're not going to be talking to somebody who just got an assignment from an editor on any given day. And I certainly, in the first question especially, understood that, the feeling we don't trust reporters, which is completely understandable. given the broader world. Again, I'm teaching political journalism these days. There is a level of trust that needs to be developed. And in an important way, I wanted to reinforce what was said, working through the press office is really the best way to do that. They are going to be able to find the right person for you to talk to and help pave the way, make you comfortable in talking to that person. Understandable, this is important work to you, and you're afraid it's going to be misinterpreted, but it has been said, the last thing a reporter wants to do is make a mistake. And it's one of the lines I use in political journalism, which I think is kind of appropriate here as well. The relationship between reporter and source is symbiosis. And the way I learned it in high school biology was two parasites living off of one another for the common good. Better example in politics, but, and it's developing as best as you can a trusting relationship using a press office as a way of doing it.
I just had this conversation with my intern just before leaving here. I had asked her to find me some sources for a story I'm doing. And she started going around to individual scientists. And I said, don't do that. Be lazy. Go to your press offices. They know these people. They'll tell you, because I've developed relationships with them. They can, they're not going to screw me and I'm not going to screw them. That's the way I look at it. It's symbiosis.
Thank you. Okay, over here, right? Did you have your hand up? Mike?
Hi, Katie Connell, Sociology and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. My question is about the sort of terrain of authorial control in op-eds specifically. I had an experience of writing one recently where there was editorial text inserted that was both factually inaccurate and counter to the thesis of the op-ed. So I was wondering, is it par for the course with op-eds as well as when being quoted in stories to not really have that kind of control or to be able to see before it's published?
No, that's it's kind of mortifying to hear that. Editors, and I'm a fairly active editor when it comes to rephrasing, reorganizing, restructuring, and I think that's often necessary, not just with academic writers, but with all kinds of writers who just either they're not professional writers and aren't that familiar with our medium, or they're so immersed in their own subject that it's very hard to get them to come out. They have a good idea and a worthy opinion, but it's very hard to get them out of the shell of their knowledge so they can communicate that to a general audience. So it's often necessary for a strong editorial hand is often necessary. That being said, inserting something that's wrong or is not or is contrary to the opinion of the writer is it's a mortal sin. It should be should be banished from the profession.
With an op-ed, shouldn't the op-ed writer get the final?
Yes, absolutely. And sometimes there are fights. We only have 800 words. I can't give you 900. We got to get 100 words out of this piece. We have no flexibility on that. If you want the piece to run, it's got to run at 800 words. So that's the way it is, and generally these things get ironed out amiably. Sometimes there are battles, and maybe once in my career a writer has pulled a piece because we couldn't agree, but that's highly unusual.
Hello, I'm Alex. I still don't know too well what I'm doing here. They brought me, my teacher, instead of in English program, and I just could understand more or less 10 of 100 you were speaking about, but although that I could know that you are more or less in the world of the periodism, of the TVs, and all of this stuff. So I'm from Catalonia, you know what's going on there. And I'm living more than here, I think, how the different newspapers and TVs, even TVs that are officials of the state, could be used as saying too much about himself, about his point of view, in my opinion, until could you say that they are lying in some way. How is your opinion about that? How one public TV or newspaper about that could focus something about that, and if there is some point of they are missing too much information that you can tell that they are lying. If you think it's, I think, a little bit open question, just because I'm not too well what I'm asking. But could you understand more or less my question?
I'm not exactly sure I understand the final question you're coming down with. Could you just...
Okay. Until where for one media public, newspaper or something that speaks for everyone, that it for the leaders that they are leading these newspapers, until to the interest of himself, the media news of himself, could be done saying the other part that there are things that really exist, and if there is some point that you can consider that they are lying or something like that. I don't know if it was more or less concise, just I try to do that.
Well, I'm going to interpret your question. One is, it's not our job to tell who's lying, who's not telling the truth. So we consider ourselves try to be independent, right? And we're trying to navigate through that, try to be accurate and honest. The truth will leave to other people. In terms of, if I were to put it in science terms, you can take a look at the climate controversy, right? There's a certain understanding of climate that's broadly accepted, and there's questions, because that's what science does, right? Scientists try to get to the next question because they want to get their next funding, right? There's more questions and it leads to questions, and more curiosity leads to more curiosity. That's the nature of science. In terms of climate science, where you have one group of people or collections of people or just an individual who just denies it, and they're in a position of tremendous authority and responsibility, it becomes really hard, right? You're going to call Trump a liar? Let's put a point on it, right? What do you say? How do you navigate those things? Well, with great difficulty. And therefore, you arm yourself with the facts, make sure you got them as accurate as possible and as honest as possible.
All right, thank you. In front here.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. My name's Deb Soek. I'm a cardiology researcher at the Medical Center. And in my life, we always have to talk about the animal in the room, which is animal research. And one of the things, I'm very used to talking about it. I've been involved with animal welfare at this institution, at others for years. So I know how to talk to people about what we do and the things we do to make sure our animals are taken care of. But trying to get researchers to talk about their animal researcher is like pulling teeth. A lot of them won't even talk to their significant others about it. So seeing people like you, I would be able to say, hey, these people are really trustworthy. They know what they're doing. They're not going to turn around and sick PETA on you, and they'll protect you if necessary against some of the attacks that happen. But how do you get somebody who walks in and doesn't really want to talk about their research, because they know if you talk about animal research, you get a whole bunch of emotions coming up?
Well, one is it the subject of the story. I mean, is this, as far as I can, for the most part, an animal is a test tube to me, right? I just want to see your research. I want to see how you derived it. I want to see how it fits into the rest of the world. That said, I spent 2 years studying Balbc mice, which is a purebred, hybridization of a mouse. But in any event, you know, I don't think we have prejudice one way or the other. I would like there to be less, you know, chimpanzee research and all that, but unless the story's about chimpanzees, I'm more interested in your research. That's my position.
Do you ever run into any issues visually with that? Or, I mean, is it end up being a different issue with broadcast versus print or online?
An immediate case of it in a program we're co-producing with the BBC about the extraordinary active destructive volcanoes that are in Central Africa, in the Central African Republic. And one of the threats to the people of Goma, the city on the edge of Rwanda, the Rwandan border with 1 million people in it, is not just the runniest lava in the world occasionally comes down the mountainside, wiping out everything, but there's CO2 and methane in the lakes, posing a very, very significant risk of, you know, a catastrophic disaster. And then around the villages, around Goma, there are bits of terrain where villagers can wander in, and like a roach motel, you want, well, that's not a very good comparison. My apologies, it's not a very tasteful comparison. Anyway, the point is that, for example, there are deaths of young children who are simply asphyxiated by CO2 getting into these cavities. And the BBC went and they filmed, the local scientist had no compunction in dragging a goat into one of these cavities, and the goat went sort of bye-bye and was hauled out again. They were being careful about it and respectful to the goat, brought it out and revived it, and it was okay, a little bit wobbly. And that was okay for the BBC to put on the air, astonishingly. And my boss just freaked out and said, "We can't put that on the air. We'll be dead in the water," so to speak. So luckily they had filmed it with the scientists going in just with a meter to measure the CO2. So yeah, we're very aware of this, just the sensitivities around it, because it totally distracts from the science for a start if your audience is getting upset because of a piece like that.
But you know, you're a heart researcher, right? So there was just a study that came out about stents. And the researchers gave half people stents and half the people they didn't tell, and they didn't give them stents. Now, if I was covering that story, and I'd love to, that would be part of my story, is why you uninformed consent? I mean, you know, what kind of experimental model is that? Now that's the story as far as I'm concerned, but, or should be, or could be.
I often don't write about animal research just because, you know, if I'm writing about a therapeutic for something, because of what I write about, you know, if I'm looking for whether or not there's a countermeasure for, I don't know, a better malaria vaccine or a better dengue vaccine or whatever, until it gets into humans, it's way too early for me. So I typically only write about things when they get to phase 3, sometimes phase 2 if it's really, really novel and important, but you know, occasionally with something like Ebola and Marburg, the hemorrhagic fevers, I would write about animal research.
You do that work here.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to do a story about 3D bioprinters, which are going to obviate the need, or that's the belief, for animal testing. You'll be able to take individual cells, grow them, and test the cocktail of chemotherapy formulation. I will mention animal testing, but only along the way of telling the bigger story.
Other questions? Thanks.
You shouldn't be afraid. That's the moral of the story.
Scientists are. They don't want to cause. We had a big thing last year. You guys probably all know about puppy dog. So everybody wanted to.
Can you wait 1 sec for the mic to come back so everybody can hear you?
Okay. Last year we had this terrible case of animal abuse called puppy doe, and so the legislature wants to cause an animal abuse registry. Well, of course, a lot of people think scientists are animal abusers, so they want to put scientists in there. So it's become very difficult for us in Boston, Massachusetts, actually, to deal with some of these issues, and we're talking less and less about it because of that. And it's sad because there's some amazing research going on here. I know here at the university we have the TBI Institute, the Traumatic Brain Injury Institute. And the research that goes along with that is amazing. And it's not just cutting up brains, but we don't talk about the other part of it because it has to do with animal research. And it's a shame because it's amazing stuff that we do.
Interesting. I want to ask one question before you go back to the audience. You had all talked a little bit about where you get story ideas, and I think one of you mentioned Reddit AMAs, and somebody else mentioned scientists needing to get out there and get on social media, and I think everybody follows Twitter. And one thing I've heard from a lot of scientists is about a reluctance to get out on social media and on Twitter, and yet that seems to be a way that a lot of journalists find them and find stories. So can you just talk to that a little bit, or tell me, a lot of scientists fear that I don't know, putting out there too much is just asking for trouble.
I like social media. I don't like Facebook. I use Twitter a lot. I don't like being direct messaged. I really don't. Because otherwise I'd be buried alive. But capture my imagination, ask a curious question, I'm good to go.
I use Twitter a lot, but I think of it more as a broadcast tool as opposed to a receiver. You know, the stream is so wide and there's so much floating down it that if you're not watching at a particular moment, something could go by and you won't see it. So I still find that it's far more effective for somebody to come to me directly through email, or if I have an existing relationship with them, a telephone call. Don't like cold calls if I don't, but I typically still, you know, maybe I'm too old school. I typically still get most of my ideas from talking to people.
Talking to people.
I know.
It's great.
Strange.
It's great.
There are scientists who are very active, especially on Twitter, and so they develop their own persona. And the ones who are trustworthy and who are coming up with interesting ideas, I think, are very much worth paying attention to.
Yeah, like Dave O'Connor during Zika. There's a guy at the University of Wisconsin, Dave O'Connor, who was doing testing in primates and sharing his data in real time before he even published. And he's very active on Twitter. And so a lot of people were following his work. That was quite cool.
Also, maybe they're in a minority, you know, there aren't that many out there, but scientists who run their own blogs, in some cases, go-to, the first thing I think about. I mean, anthropology and human origins is one of my main beats at Nova, and there is at the University of Wisconsin, John Hawkes runs this extraordinary blog, which is really well written, but also really focused on cutting edge stuff. And it's absolutely, if some big news piece breaks, I think, oh, I wonder what John Hawkes is saying about it. So I suspect for the average working scientist, having the energy to do that on top of their teaching and research is a whole other, you know, there are many obstacles towards doing it, but I think it's an extraordinary contribution to the public good and to having the media take on serious stories.
Right. Any other questions from the audience? One more in front.
Hi, my name's Nicola. I'm a member of a brand new lab, so you know our Twitter doesn't have that many followers yet. I'm sure our blog doesn't make a big impact yet. Do you have any specific advice or actions that we could take to get our name out there and maybe get some media attention?
What kind of work? What kind of lab?
Oh, we're a marine science lab, and we study corals and climate change.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Got off to a good start.
Yeah.
So Barbara asked me to tell you about something we're going to be doing, and you've captured my imagination anyhow. So I like environmental science. I do a lot of that. I was a host of Living on Earth, a National Public Radio environmental show, and WBUR is starting an environmental vertical, for lack of a better word for it. Tell me a story. That's all you need to do. And you know, you can get me through Twitter by follow me, I'll follow you, and now we're connected, and now we've got a relationship. You raise something interesting, and I'm there. I mean, you know,
Give me a big idea.
Yeah,
or a
give me
big
idea.
question. Nova
Yeah.
thrives on big questions.
It's all about
big ideas.
questions.
And maybe you think your idea isn't big enough, but you're often maybe you're not aware of how you can make it connect to the even broader debate that's going on about climate change or ocean acidification or what have you. So don't be afraid to link your humble little project to, because it could be a vital link in the whole ongoing progress of the field and in the public understanding of what's going on.
And I don't want to trivialize this, but superlatives go a long way in catching a reporter's attention. Like first, biggest, last, largest, worst. I mean, I hate to say that, but make it important. If it's important, I want to know about it, and that that's my audience. They want to know about it. It's the way to do it.
I think another thing I just wanted to emphasize you all brought up before is about the sort of the Dropbox press kit and about how much this helps when a scientist pitches a story, if there's pictures or video or sound. Do you use recorded sound bites?
I love it. I love it. If I can hear a story, you've won half the battle.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's probably something for
He
scientists
uses
to keep
pictures,
in mind.
right? And they're going to use
We use
photographs.
yeah.
They use, but he needs moving pictures too, and graphs and graphics. I need sound. Sound tells the story.
Yeah. Right. Any last questions? All right, I'm going to ask one last question of the panel before we wrap up. Is can everybody just sort of give this? You have a crowd of scientists here. Can you give them one sort of take-home message? And you're going to have to go first, so you have time to think, but you'll have to go first. What's the? if you could tell scientists anything about communicating with the public through science media, what do you want them to know?
Communicate your passion for why you got involved in your science to begin with. If you let that come through by telling a good story, you're halfway there, and you'll get our attention, I would say.
KISS, keep it simple. I'm stupid. Make it simple. If you can explain it to me, then I know.
I'm going to fall back to something I've said, I think, twice already in this panel, maybe 3 times. Find the people who tell the kinds of stories that you want to have told and establish a relationship with them. Blanketing every journalist on the planet with your pitch won't get you very much, but if you find the right person, it'll make a big difference.
Read widely. Find writers whom you admire, not necessarily in your field, but find writers who communicate very well and imitate them.
Great. Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much to our panelists. We appreciate you coming. There's still food out there, I believe. Okay, great. Please help yourself. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you to Gloria Waters for sponsoring this. Thank you.